Have you ever wondered why the most ethical person in the room rarely seems to come out on top? We've all seen it happen. Honest colleagues passed over for promotions while office politicians climb the ladder. Principled business owners struggling while competitors cut corners and thrive. Think of figures like Alan Turing, whose integrity and service to his country were repaid with persecution. Or whistleblowers like Jeffrey Wigand, who told the truth about big tobacco and lost everything. It's a pattern so persistent it seems almost inevitable. But what if it is? What if there's a cruel logic to why moral behaviour so often leads to disadvantage rather than success? Today, we're exploring one of philosophy's most troubling questions through the lens of evolutionary biology, game theory, and modern psychology. And the answer might disturb you. Because what we'll discover is that morality isn't just unrewarded in competitive environments, it's actively punished. From business to politics to everyday social dynamics, the uncomfortable reality is that being good is often exactly what prevents you from winning. And understanding why this happens might be the key to protecting yourself from exploitation, or even rethinking what winning actually means. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes published Leviathan, describing life in the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes understood something fundamental. Without enforcement mechanisms, cooperation is dangerous. The person who extends trust can be exploited by those who don't reciprocate. Covenants without the sword are but words, he wrote, recognizing that moral agreements mean nothing without power to back them up. This cuts to the heart of our paradox. Moral behaviour requires vulnerability. It means keeping promises even when breaking them would benefit you. It means telling truths that hurt your interests. It means respecting boundaries that others might violate for gain. Hobbes observed that truly moral people face a structural disadvantage in competitive environments. Why? Because morality inherently involves constraints that amoral competitors don't share. Consider what happens when a genuinely ethical person enters a cutthroat industry. They refuse to lie to customers while competitors make false promises. They honour contracts even when breaking them would be profitable. They respect intellectual property while others steal ideas freely. In settings where ruthlessness trumps restraint, these moral commitments become handicaps. Look at the contrast between figures like Nikola Tesla, who died in poverty despite his genius, versus Thomas Edison, who built an empire partly through aggressive business tactics and credit-taking. Tesla's idealism made him a scientific hero but a commercial failure. Meanwhile, the Gilded Age's robber barons, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, accumulated vast fortunes through practices we'd now consider unethical. A 2019 study from the Academy of Management Journal found something revealing. Employees who scored high on moral identity were significantly less likely to engage in strategic impression management and political maneuvering. While this made them more trustworthy, it also made them less likely to advance into senior leadership positions. Think about that. Being genuinely moral might actually prevent you from reaching positions where you could implement moral policies. But moral commitment isn't the only factor at play. If ethics can be a liability in competitive games, what qualities actually help people succeed? This brings us to a principle from evolutionary biology that explains why we so often lose to those who cheat. Have you ever noticed how the person willing to lie, cheat, or manipulate often seems to prosper while honest people struggle? This isn't just bad luck, it's game theory in action. In the 1970s, biologist Robert Trivers developed theories around reciprocal altruism and deception. He identified a crucial asymmetry. In any interaction between cooperators and defectors, the defector gains an immediate advantage. They receive the benefits of cooperation without paying the costs. Imagine a business negotiation. The party willing to misrepresent their position gains leverage. The party committed to honesty reveals their true constraints. Who has the advantage? Modern research in behavioral economics confirms this dynamic. A 2018 study in Nature found that in one-shot prisoner's dilemma games, where participants interact only once with no reputation consequences, defection rates exceeded 60%. When there's no expectation of future interaction, taking advantage becomes the dominant strategy. Consider how this plays out globally. In China's business culture, guanxi relationships theoretically enforce cooperation, yet corruption scandals reveal how trust is regularly exploited. In America's financial sector, the 2008 crisis showed how institutions deemed too big to fail exploited moral hazard, taking risks they wouldn't bear consequences for. In Scandinavian countries with high trust cultures, immigration debates reveal tensions when newcomers haven't internalized reciprocity norms. The evolutionary biologist Robert Axelrod famously showed that tit-for-tat strategies, cooperating first, then mirroring your opponent, can succeed in repeated games. But here's the catch. These strategies only work when you'll interact again, when reputation matters, when defection has consequences. In our increasingly anonymous, mobile, globalized world, more and more interactions are effectively one-shot games. You'll never deal with this customer again. You'll never work with this contractor twice. You'll never see this community member after you move. The structural conditions that favour cooperation are eroding. A 2015 study from Cornell found that psychopathic traits predicted entrepreneurial success in certain industries, particularly those with minimal regulation and high information asymmetry. The researchers concluded that environments with weak accountability naturally select for precisely the personality types least constrained by ethical considerations. Why does this happen? Because in competition, the person willing to violate norms accesses strategies that rule followers cannot. They can undercut prices below cost to destroy competitors. They can make promises they'll never keep to win contracts. They can exploit loopholes that others regard as off-limits. This strategic advantage explains how amoral actors might initially succeed. But there's something even more insidious at play, a mechanism that protects them from accountability. Hobbes understood something crucial about moral systems. They only work when violations are detected and punished. In Leviathan, he argued that without enforcement, moral rules become suggestions that the unscrupulous simply ignore. For he that should be modest and tractable, and perform all he promises in such time and place where no man else should do so, should but make himself a prey to others. What Hobbes recognized was that ethical people in unethical environments don't reform those environments, they become victims within them. This creates what game theorists call an enforcement problem. Moral systems require three conditions: detection of violations, consequences for violators, and willingness to impose those consequences. When any of these fail, the system collapses. Think of doping in professional cycling. Lance Armstrong's success came not just from performance-enhancing drugs, but from an elaborate detection avoidance system and intimidation of potential whistleblowers. The enforcement mechanism failed at every level. In modern corporate fraud, executives at Enron, WorldCom and Theranos continued for years because accounting complexity obscured violations. Regulatory agencies lacked resources for thorough investigation, and whistleblowers faced retaliation rather than protection. In authoritarian regimes from Cambodia's Khmer Rouge to North Korea's Kim dynasty, moral behaviour becomes actively dangerous because enforcement mechanisms punish virtue rather than vice. This creates what sociologists call enforcement cascades. When violations go unpunished, others conclude that the rules don't actually apply. When rule followers are punished while rule breakers prosper, the system inverts. Virtue becomes stupidity. Consider the financial industry's treatment of whistleblowers. Studies show that employees who report fraud typically suffer career destruction. Fired, blacklisted, financially ruined, while the institutions they exposed often face minimal consequences. This sends a clear signal. Being ethical is professionally suicidal. Dr. C. Fred Alford, who studied whistleblowers extensively, found that the overwhelming majority regretted their decision to speak up, not because they were wrong, but because the personal costs were catastrophic, while meaningful change was rare. Ask yourself, have you ever known something was wrong but stayed silent because speaking up would hurt you more than the wrongdoer? That's this enforcement failure at work. Yet even knowing this, we still want to believe that goodness will ultimately prevail. This hope makes us vulnerable to continued exploitation. Why do we keep believing that virtue will be rewarded when experience suggests otherwise? The answer lies in cognitive biases and psychological needs that blind us to uncomfortable realities. Genuine morality often requires accepting harsh truths about the world. Real ethics means acknowledging that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, that following rules in systems where others cheat leads to disadvantage, that sacrifices may never be repaid. But these truths are psychologically painful. Men are generally incredulous, never really trusting new things unless they have tested them by experience. Machiavelli wrote those words about political change, but they apply equally to moral disillusionment. We resist believing that ethical behaviour might be punished until we experience it directly. Consider what happens in times of moral reckoning. People rarely embrace the whistleblower who says the system rewards corruption and punishes honesty, and this will continue. Instead, they follow those who promise justice will prevail, good will triumph, the arc of history bends toward righteousness. The scientific approach, acknowledging that moral behaviour can be disadvantageous in certain game structures, struggles to compete with the psychological comfort of just world narratives. Or consider discussions of economic inequality. Actual economists acknowledge how winner-take-all markets and network effects concentrate wealth regardless of merit. But political figures offering work hard and you'll succeed narratives, while demonstrably false for many, prove more appealing than uncomfortable truths. In a remarkable 2016 experiment, researchers at the University of Illinois found something disturbing about moral reasoning. When subjects were presented with evidence that ethical business practices led to worse financial outcomes than unethical practices, they engaged in motivated reasoning to dismiss or reinterpret the data. Even when the evidence was clear, participants couldn't accept that morality might be punished. Psychologists call this the just world hypothesis, our need to believe that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. Studies show that this belief intensifies under threat or uncertainty. When our faith in moral order is challenged, we don't abandon the illusion, we cling to it more desperately. This creates a tragic dynamic. The more evidence we encounter that goodness is punished, the harder we work to explain it away. We tell ourselves the cheater will eventually face consequences. The exploiter will get their comeuppance. The universe will balance the scales, but what if it won't? What if we're psychologically defending ourselves from a truth we're not prepared to accept? Ask yourself, have you ever seen someone suffer for doing the right thing and found yourself thinking they must have done something else wrong? That's your just world bias at work, protecting you from moral dissonance. While our psychological need for moral order explains part of this dynamic, there's an even more disturbing dimension. One that reveals why good people don't just fail to win. They actively help their own exploiters succeed. Here's where the psychology becomes truly dark. Moral people don't just face disadvantages in competition. They often inadvertently support the very systems that exploit them. In perhaps the most unsettling insight from social psychology, researchers have found that highly moral individuals are more likely to cooperate with and trust immoral actors, precisely because of their ethical commitments. A 2017 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people high in honesty-humility were significantly more likely to be exploited in economic games. They extended trust even when their partners had demonstrated untrustworthiness. Their moral commitments made them predictably exploitable. Consider the contrasting approaches of Martin Luther King Jr. versus Malcolm X in the Civil Rights Movement. King's commitment to nonviolent resistance, while morally admirable, made activists vulnerable to violence from opponents facing no such constraints. His principled approach created a symmetric warfare where one side was armed and willing to use force while the other was disarmed by principle. In modern contexts, we see ethical consumers trying to change corporate behavior through purchasing choices while competing against millions of consumers who prioritize price over principle. We see honest politicians constrained by truth, while opponents face no consequences for lying. We see principled journalists struggling against clickbait merchants in an attention economy. This pattern appears cross-culturally. In Japan, the cultural emphasis on obey, harmony, and avoiding confrontation creates vulnerability to exploitative workplace practices. In Germany, despite strong worker protections, studies show that highly conscientious employees are more likely to be taken advantage of with unpaid overtime. In Silicon Valley, idealistic young engineers join companies with promises of changing the world, only to find themselves building addictive products and surveillance systems. In 2014, researchers from Stanford found that moral rebels, individuals who speak up against unethical practices, face not just opposition from bad actors, but often from good people who are invested in preserving social harmony. The whistleblowers' real enemies aren't the corrupt. It's the majority who prefer comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths. This creates what philosophers call moral entrapment. The more committed you are to ethical behavior, the more predictable and exploitable you become. Those willing to defect can identify cooperators and systematically take advantage of them. The moral person becomes not just disadvantaged but actively complicit in their own exploitation. Understanding these dark dynamics reveals why individual moral commitment isn't enough. We need to examine the environmental conditions that determine whether ethics becomes an asset or liability. Hobbes understood that different social contracts reward different behaviours. Some environments make cooperation rational, others make defection inevitable. What determines which type of system develops? Several structural factors emerge. First, iteration and time horizons. In environments with repeated interactions and long relationships, reputation mechanisms create incentives for cooperation. Think of small-town businesses where everyone knows everyone. Cheating customers means losing future business and social standing. But in environments with transient relationships and short time horizons, defection becomes rational. Online marketplaces with anonymous vendors, corporate executives with short tenure and golden parachutes, political systems with term limits but no post office accountability. These structures actively reward short-term exploitation. Second, information transparency and verification. When actions and outcomes are visible, moral behaviour can be rewarded and immoral behaviour punished. But when complexity obscures causation, cheaters prosper. The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present. Machiavelli recognised that when consequences are delayed or hidden, promises become meaningless. Financial instruments so complex that even regulators can't evaluate them. Supply chains so long that exploitation is invisible to end consumers. Political decisions with outcomes that manifest after electoral cycles. Complexity becomes a shield for immorality. Third, power distribution and exit options. Decentralized systems where participants can exit abusive relationships tend to select for cooperation. The ability to leave creates market discipline. But when exit is costly or impossible, monopolistic markets, geographic immobility, authoritarian states, exploitation becomes sustainable. The 2008 financial crisis exemplified how concentrated power eliminates accountability. Institutions were too big to fail, meaning they could impose costs on society without bearing consequences themselves. Fourth, cultural narratives and socialization. Societies that venerate rule breakers as innovators and mavericks create different incentive structures than those that honor duty and restraint. America's celebration of disruptive entrepreneurship versus Japan's emphasis on corporate loyalty. Wall Street's greed is good ethos versus Scandinavia's jantelagene, law of jante, discouraging individual aggrandizement. These cultural frameworks shape what behaviors are rewarded. Ask yourself this: In your own environment, which structural factors promote ethical behaviour and which punish it? Understanding these forces can help you navigate your path and recognise when systems are rigged against goodness. Even in well-structured systems, good people can still lose by failing to recognise and counter specific exploitation tactics. Unethical actors don't succeed randomly. They deploy specific psychological and social tactics to exploit moral individuals while protecting themselves from consequences. First, they weaponize moral commitments against moral people. By invoking fairness, consistency, and principle, they trap ethical individuals into one-sided agreements. You said you believe in free speech, so you must allow my propaganda. You claim to value forgiveness, so you must excuse my violations. You support giving chances, so you must tolerate my continued failures. This rhetorical judo turns ethical commitments into weapons against those who hold them. Psychologists call this moral licensing exploitation, using someone's stated values to manipulate their behaviour. Studies show that people reminded of their moral credentials become more vulnerable to requests that violate their interests. Second, they exploit guilt and responsibility displacement. By framing their failures as somehow caused by others' success, they shift responsibility. The cheater claims everyone cheats, so refusing to cheat is really just self-righteousness. The exploiter claims their victim enabled the exploitation by being naive. The corrupt official claims the system is corrupt anyway, so their participation changes nothing. Third, they employ what psychologists call DARVO: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. When confronted with wrongdoing, they deny it occurred. When denial fails, they attack the accuser's motives and character. Finally, they claim to be the real victim of an unjust accusation. This pattern appears everywhere, from domestic abuse to corporate fraud to political corruption. Fourth, they create complexity and ambiguity around moral questions. By making simple ethical issues seem complicated, they create paralysis and doubt. It's not really lying, it's strategic framing. It's not theft, it's disruption. It's not exploitation, it's opportunity. When Machiavelli wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are," he identified this principle. By controlling appearance and creating interpretive ambiguity, immoral actors avoid clear judgment. Fifth, they exploit time asymmetries and attention economics. Ethics violations can happen in moments. Discovery and accountability take months or years. By the time consequences arrive, the perpetrator has moved on, the public has moved on, or fatigue has set in. Consider your own experience with broken promises or betrayed trust. How often did the betrayer face meaningful consequences versus simply moving on to new victims? Recognizing these dark patterns is essential, but recognition alone isn't enough. We need concrete strategies to protect ourselves without abandoning our values. At the individual level, what psychologists call wise compassion, distinguishing between situations deserving trust and those requiring protection, becomes essential. This defense rests on three practices. First, we must cultivate strategic ethics, the ability to recognize when environments punish moral behavior and adjust accordingly. This isn't abandoning morality, it's refusing to let others weaponize our values against us. Research shows that successful cooperators in competitive environments employ conditional cooperation, extending trust initially, but withdrawing it immediately when betrayed. Think of it as an immune system for ethical behavior. Just as physical health requires distinguishing between beneficial bacteria and dangerous pathogens, moral health requires distinguishing between good faith cooperation and exploitation. Second, we need to develop enforcement willingness, the commitment to imposing costs on defectors even when doing so is personally costly. This means whistleblowing despite career risks, rejecting corrupt systems despite short-term disadvantages, supporting those who stand up even when we're not personally affected. Philosopher Peter Singer argues that effective altruism requires not just good intentions, but strategic effectiveness. Apply that logic broadly. Effective ethics means creating actual consequences for violations, not just expressing disapproval. Third, we should practice systematic boundary defense, the discipline of protecting our commitments and resources from exploitation, regardless of how requests are framed. Ancient Stoics recommended negative visualization, imagining worst cases to build resilience. Modern applications mean anticipating exploitation attempts and preparing refusals in advance. At the collective level, institutional design becomes critical. Systems can be structured to protect ethical actors rather than leaving them vulnerable. Here too, 3 pillars emerge. First, we need robust reputation systems, mechanisms that track behavior across interactions and time, making defection costly even in seemingly one-shot games. Contrast platforms like eBay with reputation systems to anonymous markets. The Hawala system in Islamic finance works through reputation networks spanning continents. Digital technology makes comprehensive reputation tracking increasingly feasible. Second, institutions must lower enforcement costs, making accountability less dependent on individual heroes willing to sacrifice everything. Mandatory reporting systems, anonymous reporting protections, automatic penalties rather than requiring victims to pursue justice. Structural incentives that align personal and collective interests. Third, we must redistribute power asymmetries, ensuring that ethical actors aren't systematically disadvantaged. Antitrust enforcement, worker protections, political campaign finance reform, progressive taxation. These aren't just social justice concerns. They're prerequisites for environments where morality remains rational. Education ties these together. We must stop teaching children that good behaviour will automatically be rewarded. Instead, teach them game theory. Show them how systems work. Prepare them to recognise exploitation and defend against it. Athens fell partly because it taught noble ideals without street-level survival skills. Sparta survived longer through harsh realism. Perhaps what we need is synthesis, Athenian ideals protected by Spartan awareness. Once again, I want you to ask yourself, in your life, which of these protections do you employ? Which could you develop? And if we designed systems assuming people can be exploited, rather than assuming goodness prevails, what kind of world might we create? As we reach the end of this exploration, we return to the question that began it. What would philosophers of power say about defending morality in an immoral world? Hobbes has been dismissed as a cynic for centuries, but he wasn't celebrating the dynamics he described, he was warning us. By understanding how cooperation fails rather than how we wish it succeeded, he believed we could build systems that protect rather than punish ethical behaviour. The condition of man is a condition of war of everyone against everyone, in which case everyone is governed by his own reason. This observation reminds us that without enforcement mechanisms, morality becomes suicidal. Ethics requires power structures that make good behaviour sustainable. The intersection of political philosophy, evolutionary biology and modern psychology reveals uncomfortable truths about why good people struggle. But uncomfortable truths are precisely what we need if we hope to build environments where virtue becomes viable. The path forward isn't pretending these dynamics don't exist. It's understanding them deeply enough to counter them. It's designing systems that protect cooperators rather than leaving them vulnerable. It's developing personal practices that defend our values without enabling our exploitation. Most importantly, it's recognizing that while goodness may face disadvantages in amoral competition, strategic ethics, morality combined with enforcement and boundary defense, remains our best hope for creating systems where doing right doesn't mean finishing last. What dynamics have you noticed in your own life? Have you experienced situations where ethical behavior was punished while cheating was rewarded? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this exploration valuable, consider subscribing and sharing with others who might benefit from these insights. Until next time, remember, Understanding why good people lose doesn't mean accepting defeat. It means gaining the power to change the rules of the game,